Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. A few years ago I was at Half Price Books, where I practically live, and I found a copy of this beautiful little book by Osamu Dazai in French. The title is La Femme de Villon, so Villon's wife, and I had not heard of it. I was very happy to find it. I did not think twice, and after thanking God for the millionth time for the fact that I can read French, I got a copy of it without even hesitating. Now, I have good news for you. The text is available in English. All you need to do if you want to read Villon's Wife in English is get a copy of Donald Keene's anthology, Modern Japanese Literature, which is, by the way, packed with interesting stuff. So, it's one of those situations where you can't go wrong. So many years later, I reread it, I took some notes, and I wanted to share my impressions with you on this relatively unknown, relatively obscure text by one of the masters of Japanese literature, Osamu Dazai. As you know, Osamu Dazai is associated with the I novel and with autobiographical literature in general. Villon's Wife falls under that category too, but it has an added element, which is this. We get the perspective of a woman. The protagonist is a female, and she is the narrator also. So I would say that in a way you could describe Villon's Wife as the other side of the coin, or the other story to a text like No Longer Human. And speaking of No Longer Human, there are many connections between the two texts. So if you happen to be a fan of Osamu Dazai's most famous novel, I would definitely check out Villon's Wife. It is really a great precursor or a great pretext to that other great novel. So let me tell you a little bit about the text in terms of the genre, in terms of the content, right? What is Villon's Wife? If you look at it, right, and this is what happened to me, I made some assumptions based on the edition that I have right here, and I would love to be able to tell you that this is a novella. That's what I thought it was, because it was published independently, or autonomously as a separate text, but actually Villon's Wife is a good old short story. In this edition that I have right here, it is only 60 pages long. The translation in English is even shorter than that because the pages are larger. So we have 60 pages. The story is divided into 3 little chapters. The first one takes up basically about just, half of the text, and the other 2 chapters, which are of equal length, take up about a fourth of the entire text. Now, this edition does not come with an introduction or with a foreword or anything like that, unfortunately. And it does not even come with a description, because what you get in the back cover is actually an excerpt from the text. When they do that sometimes. It is a very good excerpt because it's the part where the title is described, where we find out why this is titled La Femme de Villon. We're going to go into that a little bit later. But I really appreciated that because, as I have told you before in previous videos, sometimes I like to experience a text, novel, novella, or whatever it happens to be, without knowing basically anything about it. So this was one of those situations for me, and I was very happy about that. Let me tell you a little bit about the plot and the characters involved. So the story begins in a very interesting way because as the story starts, a woman is woken up all of a sudden, right, by her husband coming in the middle of the night, drunk, she assumes. Very interesting, right? So we have this sudden beginning. It's like it wakes us up too, right, as readers. And immediately, within the first page or first couple of pages, we find out that they have a child, a son, who is malnourished, sickly, and I would say even underdeveloped, right? The husband is never at home. They have no money for doctors. So basically the narrator is raising this child by herself under very, very difficult circumstances. Now we are still digesting all of this, right? On page 2, when another couple shows up and the man is calling for this woman's, the narrator's husband. Mr. Otani is his name, by the way. And he's calling him a thief, right? So it's like, get out of there, thief, come here, all of that. And it's very, very violent in the sense that we are not expecting anything like this to happen so close to the beginning of the tale. To make things worse, Mr. Otani takes out a knife and he runs away. He goes into the street, leaving his wife with the child to deal with this other couple who are clearly not happy, calling Mr. Otani a thief. So after that, we hear the story of this other couple who happen to own a restaurant where Otani usually goes to drink. And basically, the story here is that Otani owes them money, right? He has been drinking a lot and just not paying for his drinks. So it's really a pathetic story, right? And what I like about it is towards the end of the first part, the reaction of the narrator to this pathetic story, right? I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I think it's very interesting and it really sets the mood. You can tell by that reaction that we are definitely reading an Osamu Dazai story. Another important element that we find out in this story by the restaurant owners is that Otani is actually an author. He is a poet, apparently a very good one, a relatively famous one, and he also claims to be an heir of an aristocrat. Of course, he is not an aristocrat because he lives in a very poor place, in this situation with his wife and the child where they have no money or anything like that. But those are his claims. That is his past, basically, if you want to look at it that way. So his wife asks the couple, can you give me some time? Just give me one day. Do not call the police. Do not make any trouble about this, and I will try to figure out the situation and get the money back to you. They accept. The next day, the wife goes to the restaurant with her son, and while she's there, some of the customers assume that she is a new waitress. So this gives her an idea. She thinks, okay, I can work here, and by working, I can pay my husband's debts to this couple right here who seem very nice, actually. So she gets her hair done, she gets some makeup, and eventually she becomes very popular at the restaurant with the customers. She's like a bit of a celebrity too. And the husband continues to visit the restaurant also, so they can talk, they have conversations there briefly and everything. And for one moment, everything is going great, everything is wonderful, and it is exactly at that moment when you remember that this is an Osamu Dazai story, so it cannot stay wonderful. Okay, something is probably going to happen, and something does happen. Okay, I have just given you the general information. I will not go into the details because I really want you to read the story, so definitely I will not spoil the ending for you or anything like that. So I told you before that there were many connections with No Longer Human, right? This is in the details and also in the general aspect or the general plot of the story and the characters that are involved. At one point, for example, Otani is reading an article that somebody has written about him, because remember that he's a poet, and the critic calls him inhuman. So you have the connection right there, even in that detail, right? He's inhuman, no longer human, and you can look at it that way. One obvious connection that I found here also was the use of irony and even frivolity as masks, right? You can definitely see that in No Longer Human, and it is definitely present here, as well as the obsession with death, right? This idea, this desire for death, and maybe this inability to die. At one point, the character of Otani is talking to his wife, and he says that he has always had this desire to die. Even he says, from the moment that I was born, all that I have been thinking about is death. But he says he is unable to die, as if, and I'm paraphrasing here, right? As if there were some kind of a god who does not want him to die. So you can see how dark this is. And then when you look at the Otani's relationship, right, between them, there is much there of the relationship between Oba and Yoshiko in No Longer Human. You have this meeting, right? These two characters, the cruel, selfish, self-absorbed, self-destructive man with the good woman, which seems like something directly out of Dostoevsky. But of course that is not surprising because Dostoevsky was a big influence on Dazai. Let me tell you a little bit now about the themes and the purpose, the narrative purpose of Villon's Wife. I would say that, as I told you before, right, Villon's Wife represents the woman's perspective. So in that sense, there is also a connection with that other important novel by Osamu Dazai, which is, of course, The Setting Sun, right? We do have also that connection with the female perspective. And if I had to choose two main themes of Villon's Wife, I would say those are sacrifice, self-sacrifice, and also the resilience of women. Those are two things that you can clearly see right here. For the narrator, the biggest sacrifice, of course, is living with such an awful person as this Mr. Otani is. He is self-destructive, right, as I said before. And not only that, right, it's not only the selfishness and the self-destructiveness, but also the fact that he succumbs to self-pity, which is quite pathetic in this case. Let me give you an example. At one point, they are talking about men and women. They get to this topic for some reason. And Mr. Otani says, And here I am translating from the French, that is a translation of a Japanese text, through my Spanish. So, this could result in a catastrophe. So I apologize in advance. But he says, he's talking about women, and he says, because you women, for you there's neither happiness nor unhappiness. And then on the other hand, he says, men do not know anything except unhappiness. For men, it is all unhappiness. They are constantly or ceaselessly fighting against fear. So look at that. I mean, that is self-pity right there for you. So on top of the awful fact that she has to put up with this situation and this guy who's never home and all those details that I told you before, on top of that, the guy tells her things like this, right? So you can tell that this is quite a burden for her. There is much of Dazai in Otani. Okay, we know that, and we can tell by the reading of the text. So if I had to describe Villon's wife, I would say this is a self-deprecating self-portrait. Okay, it is also a tribute to women's perseverance, and ultimately I would say it is even kind of an act of contrition on Dazai's part, acknowledging his faults and giving credit to the women who had to live with him and put up with him and everything. Now let's look at the title, okay? La Femme de Villon. I assumed at first that it was going to have a French setting because I thought it was literally Villon's wife, but it turns out that the title is a little bit more indirect than that. So François Villon, right, the medieval poet, late medieval poet, I would say, in France. Let me give you some information about him because I think it's important to kind of look at that. So I have this book right here, Introduction to French Poetry, edited by Stanley Applebaum. It comes with a dual language text. It was published by Dover. Okay, so great book if you want to have. It's a very, very brief introduction to French poetry, but I enjoyed it a lot. And the description of Villon here says this: he is the first French writer who reveals himself to us as a complete and unique human being. So that is quite a statement already, with all his faults upon his head. Displaying thorough mastery of traditional poetic techniques, he enlivens the medieval forms and fancies with vivid personal observation drawn from his unsavory but intense existence. So unsavory and intense existence. You can already see some of the connection right there. But Villon was famous for a particular line of poetry in French, which is Mais où sont les neiges d'antan, right? Where are the snows of yesteryear? And then at one point in his life, he went to prison more than one time, and one of those times he was actually sentenced to be hanged. That did not happen, but the situation prompted another famous poem by him, which is the Ballad of the Hanged Men. Okay, that is one of the texts that most people associate with the name of Villon. In a nutshell, he was basically the figure of the scoundrel poet. So you can see why Otani, and by extension also Dazai, would relate to somebody like him. At one point in the short story, the narrator sees kind of a poster, right, announcing a publication by her husband. So her husband is a poet primarily, but he is also a critic, and he is about to publish an essay on François Villon. So that is the connection right there. And I would say that why, if somebody asks me, okay, so why make this connection with Villon? Primarily, I would say because the figure of Villon really highlights the themes of decadence that are present in this little book. The concept of a dead end that we have right here, this idea of the setting sun, right, which is something that you definitely associate with Osamu Dazai. Now, I want to talk about the ending without revealing the ending, right? I told you before that this is not a novella, as much as that breaks my heart. It is a short story, but there's a little twist here. The ending is a perfect novella ending. Okay, that is the best way for me to describe it. And what do I mean by that? It's an inconclusive ending. It's an open ending. It's the kind of ending that keeps echoing in your mind and that keeps you thinking about what you have just read. That is my favorite type of ending, and you find it most of the time in novellas. It's the kind of ending that lets you do the work and that lets you provide the actual ending to the story because you keep thinking about this. Basically, in a nutshell, the kind of ending that transcends the text. That is what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm gonna leave you with those comments, right? Because I do not want to reveal anything absolutely about the ending. I want you to experience it for yourself. So the bottom line, okay, Villon's Wife is actually one of my favorite texts by Dazai. I would never even dream of calling myself a Dazai expert or nothing like that, but of the texts that I have read, and I have read quite a few of them by him, this is one of the short stories or narratives that have actually, stayed with me and impacted me the most. So I am really surprised that it remains practically unknown in English. I believe it deserves a lot more of attention than it's actually getting. It is subtle, it is entertaining, and ultimately it is shattering. So I really recommend that you find a copy of it. Do yourself a favor, please, and read it. And once you have done that, please come back and let me know what you think, because this is one of those texts, like many others that I have talked about, that I cannot actually, discuss with anybody because I don't know anybody else who has read it. So those are my impressions on Osamu Dazai's Villon's Wife. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.